The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Yes, we, in fact, are the book club you don't have in real life. And welcome back. Joining me as always, I am Greg, by the way, and joining me as always, our resident Wheel of Time expert, in the middle of life's great hunt himself, Tylor. Tylor, how are you?
I'm doing very well. I like to think that life's great hunt is a job search, seems to be what this is potentially leading towards, which seems accurate of my life so far. Things are going really well on my end. The semester is about to start, which means that I get a bunch of really excited freshmen whose dreams I can crush when I tell them my classes are all math, and that's a wonderful feeling. How are you feeling about the start of the semester, Greg?
I'm good. I will tell you, I had a very funny thing happen. I got all my classes assigned to the same classroom, which is fantastic. Love that. Could not find the classroom. And I have worked at my job for 5 years. It turns out that 231 is hidden behind 204 and 205, completely out of sequence. I don't know if this was like a conversion job at some point in the history. The building is only about 7 years old, so I don't even know. But it was a very funny thing to kind of get up to the top number and see that they stopped at 214. And I'm like, well, that's a head scratcher there, but I found it eventually.
It's not academia if there's not something wrong with the numbering of your building. That sounds accurate. Now that us two academics have had fun with the beginning of the semester, I suggest we dive straight into Chapter 6, Dark Prophecy, unless you have any more kind of introduction before we get going, Greg.
Well, speaking of numbers that go out of order, we have two chapters that go in order. Chapter 6, Dark Prophecy, and Chapter 7, Blood Calls Blood. Yeah, you already transitioned, but I thought of mine before you said yours, so I had to get it in still.
It was solid. I like it. 2 transitions can be this podcast's go-to calling card.
All right, go for Dark Prophecy. Let's hear it.
Excellent. So we begin in Rand's dream as he is behind a door that is being battered down. The other boys are there, and we get some really dark imagery of Matt like giving up and Perrin kind of taking out his own eyeballs. It's real gross. He then wakes up and is in a room with Nynaeve. It is Egwene's room that he has fled to in the previous chapter. She is knitting and chastising him for sleeping during the day. They have a brief conversation where she is trying to kind of understand his motivation, and they briefly describe kind of the search for him. He initially assumes that it must be like the guards or the men, but she says that it is actually the servants who seem to be searching for him, and notably the Lady Amalisa seems to be actually getting dirty herself in the storeroom searching, and that strikes her as especially odd. It's at about this point that Rand hears an alarm, and something is going on, and he immediately assumes that it must be something going on with Padenfane, which is where Egwene is. So he begins running through the women's apartments. He's still wearing the worker's outfit that he was before, and he has his sword. It causes quite a commotion, including him being seen by the Amerlin seat. He then makes his way out into the courtyard, where he realizes that the alarm is actually a result of Trollocs and at least one Fade being in the fort. He then begins battling a couple of the Trollocs. He is then confronted by a Murdrail and initially is about to battle it when Ingtar arrives and says he will battle the Murdrail and lets Rand flee off into the dungeons in the basement. He arrives in the dungeons and it's bad. There are a couple of the guards have been beheaded and chopped into pieces and eaten. There is also a message for Rand written in blood on the door of the prison, telling him that Padenfane will see him again on Tomon Head. After this, Leandrin enters the room and starts questioning Rand after he had been wiping away this message. And she actually starts using the trick that we had seen her use in a previous chapter, where she tries to manipulate Rand's emotions to get him to go along with whatever she's suggesting. It seems like it's maybe starting to work, but then Moraine arrives. They have a brief conversation, and for like the fourth time in the chapter, Rand remembers Egwene exists, runs into the room, and finds that both Mat and Egwene are unconscious, but neither of them appear to be dead. And notably, Mat's dagger is missing. And this causes Moraine to get them taken away, and creates kind of a stir for Rand as he's trying to figure out what's going on and what is happening. The end of the chapter, however, is Rand chatting with Ingtar and realizing that earlier, when he was not allowed out of the gate, it was not an order from Agelmar, the Lord of the Fort. It must have come from someone else. And that's kind of the cliffhanger we're left on at the end of the chapter. So this is an interesting chapter for me because it has a lot of little scenes that feel very different and potentially in some way disconnected, right? We have a battle sequence and also a dream scene and also dark prophecy and also interrogation by an evil Aes Sedai. There's lots of things going on here. So I'm curious what stood out to you in all of that jumble. What were the moments that as a first-time reader you thought like, oh, these are the things that are grabbing me and keeping me interested in the story?
Well, I think we need to begin by announcing to our fans that our jazz quintet is launching our first album, Getting Dirty in the Storerooms, this fall. It's going to be out. We are Tylor, Greg, and the Glass Columns 3, and it's going to be fantastic. Let's see. There's a lot here. This is a quick moving chapter, and it will, again, I want to be clear that I'm never saying this is the fault of Robert Jordan, but this was one of those chapters where I found myself being half distracted reading it, and I would get a couple paragraphs down and I'd be like, whoa, wait, there's a Trolloc here? Like, that can't be right. Like, is this another dream? And going back and then, giving it the attention it deserves when I'm not dealing with children, and seeing exactly, oh, right, it's all here and laid out. But there were a couple of those types of moments, like big shifts within the chapter.
Yeah, and this is something I'll say Robert Jordan, I think, is really good at, if you're paying attention really carefully, is he makes things turn on a dime in a way that is really, really effective, but it makes it impossible to kind of half skim Robert Jordan, right? Because like you say, you miss one sentence and suddenly there are Trollocs everywhere. So I totally relate.
Yeah. So, and again, just to answer the question, kind of what stood out the most to me here, as in like, this is going to be serious moving forward. The stolen goods, most of all, right? That we have the dagger is gone and the horn is gone. And so those, to me, especially the horn, I'll say is unexpected, because it felt like we had a very clear plan, right? Yeah. This is going to be the MacGuffin of this. Is the quest is to take this horn across the continent, and now that is off the books, seemingly anyway, for the moment. And whereas with the dagger, it felt to me like, oh, did it still hold enough power that they had to retrieve it, or was this a crime of opportunity? Oh, I'm a dark friend. Here's a cool dark magic thing. I'm just going to grab this on my way out the door. Here in Boston, we have the Gardner Museum heist, which is the famous art robbery. Yeah. And there are all these like specific paintings and items they went for. And then there's just this one. It's the top of a flagpole, like from France. And it's like, oh, they just thought that was cool on their way out the door. They just grabbed that one. And so I thought, yeah, maybe the dagger's the top of the flagpole.
I think it's really interesting that you are saying this felt, kind of out of nowhere to you, because I, at least as a kid, had latched on to the fact that it was not the Great Hunt with the horn. It was the Great Hunt for the horn. And so there was no way they were going to keep it in their possession the entire book. Maybe that was the weird, like, 6th grade grammar Nazi Nazi in me, but I always assumed that this was going to be, you know, kind of going away at some point. I think that this is kind of an interesting place to now jump back to the beginning of the chapter, right? Because as we're talking about, you know, at the end of the chapter, this big momentous idea, the horn is gone, the dagger is gone. What does that mean for the story going forward? We begin with yet another Rand dream, with yet another refrain of Baal-Zaman saying, this has happened a million times and I know what's going on. Did you get anything out of this dream, or is this kind of where the skim began? I feel like I know you have a difficult time with dreams in general.
My own personal dreams, he means. I have no goals and ambitions. Well, in my notes, it says dream parentheses eye roll, because I can't draw emojis well enough. But yeah, that's kind of, I'm kind of, you know, listeners know, if you're listening to this episode, I assume you've been with us a long time and know that dreams are just not my thing. So you know, I think I wouldn't necessarily say it was as low as a skim, but I was like, okay, got it. Baal-Zaman's back. He's still a threat. I didn't really think he was gone. I think the theme of this chapter is like, hey, dummy, he's not gone, and Rand not getting it. So the fact that there was a red Aes Sedai there, and then that Perrin is seemingly more in danger than I thought. I'd kind of decided for myself that Perrin was fine, just changed, and the other wolf brother, whose name I'm forgetting, Elias, seemed like a great character and a good person. So it's like, well, Perrin will just be like him. But I think I'm starting to really feel like, oh no, this story with Perrin is not over, and there's trouble ahead for him.
Well, and I think that that's interesting to note, in that the imagery that we're seeing in this stream with Perrin is actually imagery that we had seen in the previous book for Matt, right? Because in the previous book, there was another dream of Rand's where he saw Matt had like clawed out his own eyes. And that was when Matt was under the influence of the dagger. And so the idea that Perrin is now doing the same thing probably makes us wonder, you know, what is going on with Perrin? Is there some sort of dark influence, or, you know, what is going on there? That kind of moment of resonance, I think, also highlights the other moment that I want to pull out from this dream really briefly, which is the fact that the refrain that Baal-Zaman has over and over again in this dream is specifically the phrase, it's never over. He says it's never over. The battle is never over. He says that like 3 or 4 times throughout this. It's worth noting that is also how Padan Fain's message to Rand ends. And so that resonance between the dream at the beginning of the chapter and the message at the end of the chapter, I think, is really easy to miss on a single read, but it's something that I think is worth noting on a reread like this.
And since you're linking those two, I think my mind was playing the game of, okay, what's the dark prophecy here, right? So the name of the title of the chapter. So here at the beginning, it was like, oh, okay, so we're getting a prophecy in the dream. But like previous dreams, they've been so heavy in symbology that it's not like exactly what we've learned of as prophecy here. And so then when we get to the end of the chapter and we're seeing that writing from Padan Fain, it's like, oh, is that the prophecy? And then I think we get another candidate really spelled out explicitly in the next chapter primarily. So, but I was definitely playing that game on my initial read through, and here thinking, okay, so again, maybe I need to pay more attention to this dream than others because there is such importance. We just had been through the part where we realized Moraine and the Amerlin seat had been following a prophecy. So it's like, okay, we got to pay attention to this.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting to be thinking about how is Robert Jordan thinking about the beginning of the second book as being either similar or different from the beginning of the first book, right? Because I think we're now getting a lot more of this kind of prophecy and backstory really explicitly, whereas in the first book there were a lot of like hints at things that we didn't get details on until much later. So this, I think, actually kind of highlights for me why the first book is my least favorite book, right? Is because in this book, Robert Jordan is able to take the things we know and expand on them in new and interesting ways, as opposed to just like, here's a hint at something later on. It's a hint at something later on, and it tells us something about where we are now or what the characters are doing or what happened in the previous book. And I think that is much more effective. It's actually something that I hated about Avatar 2, The Way of Water, is so much of that movie was just like the camera swinging through the vines or the ocean, depending on what act we were in. And I'm like, no, motivate this with something. And that's what I think Robert Jordan struggles with in The Eye of the World and is starting to do a little better here. The kind of world building and exposition feels a little more motivated in a way that Swinging Through the Trees of Pandora just never did. I hated that movie.
I was gonna say I didn't realize we were back in Pandora therapy. I thought we'd been through this a few times. Show me on the doll where James Cameron hurt you. That's a little dark. Sorry. But yeah, I think when you were talking, it was reminding me again about how we talked about how much of this is being built up again to remind you where we left off, right? If this was the book you jumped in on or you returned to. And I was trying, as you were talking, to remember, like, as I read through this chapter, how would I have felt if I was new to this? And this is probably the hardest piece of that. Yeah. Whereas there was new content in the last two chapters, it was very much rooted in characters and understanding their motivations. And so I think that would be very clear. Whereas here, you know, you're exactly right to point out these valences of these events that, like, you have to know the first book to see the difference and see the swerve. Yeah. And here, you know, for someone who's new, what would they be thinking about Perrin? What would they be thinking about Matt? These are essentially unanswerable questions, but they're worth thinking about. Yeah. Because, you know, again, I don't know Robert Jordan's style, but so often these are moments of resetting a little bit and saying, oh, this is what you should have been caring about, or this is what I now care about, which I didn't before. And so where we're saying, you know, he's switched Matt and Perrin, maybe it's like, well, I actually should have done this in the last book, but you know, I hit send before the manuscript was polished or whatever. Not that I'm accusing of that. And I don't know if you're ready for a transition, but I will say all of that very much informed this next conversation with Nynaeve about how Rand's still just like, I'll say the Dark One's name. He's gone. It's over. The end. And, you know, obviously when we're at the beginning of a massive series, but I would say even if this was my first path through this second book, I'd be like, all of this is clearly telling us it's not over. This is just beginning for that reason.
Yeah, and I really love that moment where Rand names the Dark One and then almost feels like a rush of blood to the head sort of feeling, and the alarms start almost immediately, because there is something to the idea of like superstition in fantasy world that always rings untrue to me, right? If you are living in a world with actual magic, why would you believe that like saying the devil's name was a problem unless it was actually a problem? So I love the idea that even this kind of, you know, it seems like a superstition. In the first book, Rand, I think, named the Dark One multiple times and it didn't do anything. The fact that that superstition is now producing the evil results that everyone thought it would for the last couple thousand years, I think is a really interesting moment, as we're now talking about kind of resetting stakes at the same time we establish new world building details. I think simultaneously saying, let's reset the stakes, the game isn't over, you know, the Dark One is still around, Baal-Zaman is still a threat, but at the same time saying not only is he still a threat, he's maybe more of a threat, right? This is a reaction to naming the Dark One that we hadn't seen in previous passes, you know, in the previous book.
And it so much felt like Harry Potter. Maybe that's just too obvious to even bother saying, right? But fear of the name gives power, and so on and so forth. So, and it's a really curious moment for Rand, and you know, talking to you, your wife, all of our friends. Everybody hates Rand. I will say I'm not that negative on him. But as I listen on, it's like, yeah, he is kind of lame.
well, and I will say, I think Rand is a wonderful, fantastic character because he grows and changes in interesting ways. But in order to grow and change in interesting ways, you kind of have to start as just like a vanilla, bland pebble. And that's what Rand is. There's nothing to him until interesting things happen.
All right. Well, and so in that regard, where we have such fear that he's been experiencing since the moment he realized the seat was arriving. And then it's like, oh, but the Dark Lord Master of the Universe, I'll just say his name.
Whatever.
I'll just threaten him. Yeah, it doesn't matter. So and as I complimented you last week, it's also just a teenager, right? Like, well, and I was just thinking in my head, it's kind of all of us, right? I mean, we should all seriously be talking about climate change all the time. That's all we should be thinking about. But it's like, nah, let's not worry about that. Let's worry about, this politician. Yeah, whatever.
No, for sure. And I think that this is actually an interesting kind of way to transition into the next section of the sequence, right? Because we get this, reminder about Nynaeve. We're learning a little bit about where Rand is and what's going on, how the Dark One is being seen. And then immediately, like, boom, alarms go off and Rand is running through the women's quarters, right? And so if we're talking about like the big problem versus the little concerns, this is a really fun scene to me of Rand like ruining all of the possible relationships with every woman in town, and as Lan says, setting off the dominoes of people trying to find him a wife, and he runs into the Merlin seat, the very woman he's been trying to avoid, and all of those concerns don't matter because there's Trollocs in the keep. Right. And so this is almost the opposite of what we're saying. Right. Sometimes Rand is a character who focuses on the thing he shouldn't. Here, he finally actually is ignoring the stupid problems to go deal with the things that could kill him. So good on Rand for once. Was there anything that you keyed in on Rand's kind of flight through the women's quarters that you thought of as interesting?
Like the whole time I was going, troll in the dungeon, troll, which is Harry Potter again. But the moment where he essentially runs directly into the seat was really interesting to me. And just how immediately they move to protect her. So his fear that he's known and that they like, do they know? Do they know? They know, buddy. Like it's an open secret. And the fact that he's viewed as a threat. And then I will say I have my next note is Tommen Head, but that's not until the dungeon. There's nothing in the women's quarters that hints ahead to Tommen Head, right?
No, there's not. I think we get the brief scene with Ingtar and the Fade.
Oh, right.
I'm more than happy to move on to what Podden Fane wrote, because I have nothing else in my notes in between. So we get this message from Podden Fane. We will meet again on Tommen Head. It's never over, Elthor. So the second half of that is a refrain from the dream that Rand has just woken up from. But then the first half is once again, for like the fourth time in this book, pointing us towards this area of the map that is nowhere near where we are right now. I'm curious what you think of this message seemingly coming from Fane as opposed to a lot of the other stuff, which is written in like Trolloc script and could have been a Myrddrail or a Fade or Fane or something like that. What do you think about this message being personal? Did that kind of key anything for you?
I thought a lot about, we talked at some point, I don't even remember when, about how this felt like a video game and like there were levels of different bosses. And I think Podden Fane had been relegated to a very low rung in my mind, that this is maybe not even a level boss, just maybe halfway through a level or something. And the way he was positioned, and like you just noted, the personal nature of this made me think I'd underestimated him. And I think my read on him prior to this had just been he was probably a good man, manipulated, overwhelmed by the darkness, and controlled now, a puppet, right? Somebody not in his own control. And then especially when Moraine kind of tried to break that control, and we know that Egwene has been visiting him seemingly regularly. It kind of felt like he's not a threat anymore. So then couple that, which you just said, that he's making this very personal message, and the fact that we know the last chapter ended with the mystery person coming to get him out. And it's like, okay, there's something more here, right? Whether acting on his own or in concert with his collaborator here, there's something greater. It seems to me like that person could have easily handed him the horn, and he's the one who left with the horn and the dagger, and he's got all the stuff. But this is all a rambling way to say definitely not what I thought Patton Fane. I thought his part in the story was done. It was an interesting guy because he chased them. He'd had some expertise, but now he's kind of gone. Yeah, I don't know.
I think it's this early in the series that I've heard people discuss this, so I'm happy to throw something that I've kind of read on the internet into the discussion. Is we've talked in the past about how a lot of kind of fantasy villains are kind of like lawful evil, right? They build empires. And Haddon Fane, even this early in the series, I think it's really easy to identify him as kind of like the spark of chaos in what is otherwise kind of our lawful kind of evil setup, right? We had, kind of armies of Trollocs moving into positions and doing things, and then Patton Fane just popping up out of nowhere every once in a while in the previous book, being like a beggar in Camelin unexpectedly, or, popping up in Faldara. And so I think that almost unpredictability is what makes Fane an interesting villain to me. Is you first expect him to be a good guy, and then you expect him to be a minor villain, and then you expect him to never show up again, and then he jumps around so much, it's difficult to figure him out. And I think that's a fun place for a villain to be, especially this early in a series, right? When there's so much time for that kind of wild card to wild all the time.
So, and I just want to make sure would you then say he's like pure chaos, like a Dark Knight Joker figure? Is he only in it for the chaos, or is he just unpredictable and changing?
So I think that question, at least what we've got in the text so far, I think I would lean towards, there is an argument I think to be made for the Joker in the Dark Knight potentially not even being evil, right? You can make an argument that he is like chaotic neutral, right? It is just about the chaos, and that is an end to itself. I don't think that's Patton Fane as we've read him so far, right? He serves the Dark One. He was a Dark Friend for like 25 years before he kind of went through the full conversion. As you were saying, is it a possession? Is it something he voluntarily went through? What exactly is going on there? We're not sure, but I think I would at least put him in the evil category, in the way that sometimes there are just like pure agents of chaos in stories. I'm not sure he's quite that. He's just the agent of chaos within the evil camp, if that distinction makes sense.
That makes sense to me.
Cool. And I think that is contrasted then with the hint of evil that we get in the next scene when Liandrin arrives and tries to manipulate Rand using her powers of channeling. And so I think this feels to me a lot more like that kind of like lawful evil situation we're talking about, right? We don't have confirmation whether Liandrin is a dark friend or just a bad person, but clearly she is on the evil side of the spectrum, but is kind of working within the organization. She went immediately to Lady Amalisa to kind of plug into that, network in order to deal with problems. What's your read on Liandrin after a couple of chapters? She's popped up in many different interesting places now, so I'm curious what you've kind of started to see, if there's any pattern that's emerging for when she pops up, or what you think her objectives might be.
So the comparison I want to make is a Game of Thrones character who I can't remember his name now. Is it Varys?
Yes. The spider.
The spider,
yeah.
Yes. And it feels very much like that with a supernatural twist. It is a kind of master manipulator and somebody who can operate quickly and effectively as a go-between to leverage one thing against the other. And I agree with how you just characterized her, that it feels much more purposeful. She has a clear set of goals and she's working towards it. She could have, just gotten Amalisa to suspect everyone and go crazy, but clearly sent her like specifically in one direction to, as you said, get dirty in the storerooms. And so looking
that is your favorite phrase for some reason.
I don't know. I wrote it down because it made me laugh so hard when you said it. So I definitely am more worried about what her big picture is. Whereas, again, especially after what you just explained, Patton Fane, I'm like, nasty, can cause big harm, probably not out to rule the world. But I kind of think Liandrin, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah. Is one of those people from the opening of the book and is clearly on orders and is accomplishing her tasks. And it's going to eventually kind of fall together like dominoes. I assume trapping the Amerlin seat and Moraine. I can't imagine she really cares about the boys as much as she has a higher target in mind.
Well, and I think that's interesting, given what we learn. To some degree, it's hinted at a couple of times in this chapter, and then it's said more explicitly in the next chapter. We learn the purpose of the Red Aja, right? We learn that the Red Aja's primary objective is to gentle men who can channel. And so it actually is, to some degree, for Leandrin, it might actually be reasonable that she is spending so much time like interrogating or investigating the men who are traveling with Moraine. It might be the one type of Aes Sedai where we wouldn't suspect some sort of ulterior motive. If Leandrin is spending a bunch of time around interesting men who are causing a stir, she might be interested in seeing whether any of them can channel.
I did just like how you said gentlemen. That was my laughter.
That's solid.
Yeah, and so I think you're right. There's a reason that she would want to kind of investigate each of the four, or three. Rather. Three. And certainly if she knows that Rand's the one who can channel and the one who has that power, obviously would want him under her control. I'm still thinking, though, as I read the interaction here, she's doing something for her, not for her Aja. This isn't about protection or anything like that. This is about, I have some ends to meet.
Yeah, and I think that is at least compatible with the details we got about Leandrin and her use of this ability to manipulate people in the previous chapter, because we learned she was more or less banned from using that by kind of official channels. So it's very likely she is kind of self-serving here. At the end of this chapter, we get the conversation with Ingtar, which I think is primarily there to reveal that the horn has been stolen. And then we also get an introduction of two characters who were named earlier, but get a little bit more detail here. So that's Verin and Seraphel, both of whom are of the Brown Aja, which I think is at least worth noting because I have a strong suspicion that you and probably me would both be Browns. These are scholars. They're wonderful people to be around. And so I was curious whether you had any kind of reaction either to Ingtar and his revelations or to these two new characters. And Verin, obviously, we get a little bit more of in the next chapter. But what did you think about kind of seeing our first kind of true scholars, given that we ourselves are scholars?
The incredible pun I wrote in my notebook. Brace yourself. Hold on to that desk. C.S. Aes Sedai. Oh, the beauty of that. That's what they are to me here.
And that's why you are on this podcast, sir.
So that was really fun. And, you know, I think you're right to say this is where we would be. And that naturally draws me towards them. Right. And I'm like, let's learn all about this. Let's figure it out with, you know, what we've studied in books and be scholars about this thing. So very much, you know, I would not go so far as to say these are major characters, although the next chapter puts a slightly different spin on that. But to have a sect of the Aes Sedai that is just towards scholarship, it also reminds me of I guess tonight's a Game of Thrones night, is the Meisters, right, with their chains, and that Sam is gonna go learn to be a Meister. So it felt kind of nice to see that type return. The difference being that's usually a monk type, and this is clearly, as all the different Aja are, female centered. And you know, you've noted before, we should give Robert Jordan some credit, though not all the credit, for being a bit more progressive than a lot of fantasy. So it was nice to see that it's not like we have secret men who do all the thing. So again, we try not to make this timely, but there's a movie out right now called Women Talking, which is based on a book. And what I just learned today, which I didn't realize, is the book is narrated by the only male character. And I was like, what? The Women Talking book is narrated by the one man, which is a choice the film chose to undo, which I think is for the wise, is a wise decision and for the best. But it would have felt something like that if suddenly it's like, oh, but the knowledge, that's for the boys. So it's nice to see that in this universe, it remains true that the women are in control of all the types of power, including scholarship.
Well, and I think that this is really interesting in light of how important deep time has seemed to be, not just for our understanding of the world, but also for the way that like Moraine is talking about prophecy in the future and kind of the cyclical nature of time. It's I think useful to note that in a world that has lost this much, basically historians and scholars being given 1/7 of the greatest institution in the world maybe feels appropriate in a way that it wouldn't in other worlds. So I think this is a really good example of the world building fitting really well into the way not only that this world has been structured, but even just the way that like Moraine, who isn't a Brown, has been talking about like seeking stories and finding, ancient tales that really kind of fits with the way that it seems like the Aes Sedai in general are approaching knowledge. They seem to value it. And this was something I think we had talked about earlier with like the Ogier and Faldara as compared to the two rivers. Some places seem to have much deeper attachments to history. The existence of the Browns would probably suggest that the White Tower would fall into the category of really having that tie to deep time.
And I will say I don't read fantasy. I'm not a fantasy reader, but it also just reminds me I really enjoyed the first two Patrick Rothfuss books, as I've mentioned on this show before. And there's such a scholarly theme to that that a library and a university are
it's
very
all at the
central to
academy,
that.
right?
Yeah, basically. And so that is also nice to see reflected here. But again, as you just noted, it refracted through this world and this mythology and done so effectively. So I want to learn more, and I'm still want to fill in all the colors. We're getting further along, but not all the way around yet.
We're what, 2 for 5, and we've got oblique references to blues and greens.
Yeah
Okay, yeah, that sounds right. Okay, cool. Okay, so unless you have anything else in chapter 6, I think it is time to move on to chapter 7, Blood Calls Blood. So this chapter begins with a Moraine POV. She, the Emerlency, Lyanna, and Verin are all gathered together, and they have just finished healing Matt. And they note that while they have done what they can, they have likely only bought Matt months. And if he is not reunited with the dagger and then again healed by the Aes Sedai, it is likely that he will die. Verin seems quite worried about how they're going to recover the dagger, because she is concerned that whoever takes it and tries to bring it back would then be infected themselves and could spread that infection if they weren't accompanied by Aes Sedai. And this is when Moraine kind of pivots her plan and proposes that Matt has to be the one who has to go and do it. It's at this point that we are introduced to the Dark Prophecy. So we have I believe it is Verin who has taken down notes on this and translated it from Trolloc, and she shares the Dark Prophecy. I'm sure we'll discuss this in much more detail, and I think very helpfully, the prophecy is a little bit dense, and so immediately the three characters in the room start talking about the prophecy and breaking it down. Once we are done talking about the prophecy, Verin takes a gamble. She says the last of the verses must be about a man who can channel. It must be one of the three men who is with you, Moraine. And both Moraine and Siuan immediately react. They embrace, they channel the power, and immediately Verin knows that yes, they were involved. And then Verin reveals that she has long suspected that they are in some way involved with the Dragon Reborn, and she's been piecing together clues for a decade. And this section of the chapter basically ends with Moraine and Siuan bringing Verin in and seemingly planning with her, and Moraine thinking basically, Verin, I really like you, but I will get rid of you if need be. We then jump into a Perrin POV. He has snuck in to see Matt as he is recovering. Someone sees him and sends for Liandrin Sedai, and then he briefly talks to Matt. I think Matt gets like a paragraph and a half of dialogue, and then it is actually Lyanna Sedai who arrives and talks to Perrin. She briefly flirts with him, and we get reference to the green Aja maybe being the flirting Aja, and
like the green M&Ms. Yeah,
exactly. That's the sexy one. And then he suspects that she lies when she says that Matt has been healed and is going to be okay. We then jump into a Rand POV. He is talking to Perrin. He apologizes for the way that he, was kind of snobby before and tried to push him away. He explains that that's all that he was doing. We then get a bit more of conversation with Ingtar, where we get some more details about, the guards and the fact that Rand will not be allowed to leave. And it is then that Lan arrives and says that Rand is going to have an audience with the Amyrlin seat, and Lan begins preparing him. And some of this preparation is like getting him dressed and making sure he looks good, but much of it is teaching him decorum and trying to tell him, things to say in certain situations. And Rand very much picks up on the fact that Lan is kind of being fatherly and trying to help him through the situation. And at the end, Lan says that he has had something made for Rand and gives him a pin with the red eagle of Manethrin to put on his jacket. And with that, he goes to see the Amyrlin seat, which presumably will be what we get to read about in the next chapter. So once again, this is an interesting, I think, kind of plot-driven series or chapter that has kind of a series of different events that are somewhat unrelated. But unlike the previous chapter, these are all pretty character motivated as opposed to just being plot and world building. So for me, this chapter worked a lot better. I'm curious whether you had the same reaction of, now that we're in the character details instead of the kind of plot details, that was more exciting to me. Was the same true for you?
I think I continue to be really thrown when we have multiple POVs in a chapter, and
That's
it
fair.
really just makes me constantly be like, well, why are we putting these all together? And the simplest answer may be they're all very short and we just need to move all of these game pieces at once for whatever comes next. But it, especially this time around, it just felt like these were such insignificant moments. Even though what you're saying is right, that they are mainly, let's connect these characters, show what that relationship is. Even there, it doesn't really feel that significant. Oh, Lan's acting fatherly towards Rand. That kind of is where they were when we zoomed in on them at the start with the wind. So it's kind of, it continues to be interesting to me that we have these. And I guess what I'm really saying is I would expect to break the kind of standard format would be for some really big specific reason. And, surveying these and the last time it was done, I didn't really see anything that significant that warranted it. So I think come the next one, I will not struggle to try to find that big reason. I'll just be like, okay, we just need to move all these pieces around.
Yeah, and I will say some of this is bias that has been introduced to you by the Eye of the World doing a lot fewer POV switches, as opposed to, as I read this feels slightly more POV switchy. I maybe used to like one in a chapter for a Wheel of Time chapter, but the Eye of the World is definitely the outlier in terms of having the least of those sort of perspective changes. So it's definitely something that, will become much more familiar, as will wind at the beginning of books and things like that. I want to begin with Verin. And her discovery, seemingly both a stab in the dark and fairly confident based on evidence that Moraine and Siuan are in some way associated with the Dragon Reborn. What did you think about these two characters kind of having a deep, dark secret in the previous chapter and immediately having someone see through it like a chapter or two later? Did that work effectively for you?
It did work effectively. And, I think it's also a way of kind of armor around like, oh, you're telling me nobody's ever figured it out.
Yeah.
Sometimes when an author can just throw you one character who's figured it out, then you're like, oh, okay, well, at least, not everybody was fooled, even if it makes very much as little sense as it did previously. And it's not as extreme as I've just made it out to be. But I did like that. And I liked that moment where they kind of recognized she's a threat. And not that I thought they were about to like slit her throat or something, but it was like, well, I guess she's in now. She's one of us. She's in the conspiracy now.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really fun moment. And I can only then connect that to what we were talking about the Brown Aja and say, oh, okay, well, now we're going to get the benefit of all this history and a much better understanding than whatever small scraps Moraine and Siuan have collected so far.
Yeah, and I think that there's a few interesting hints in this chapter of how Verin is both similar to and different from other Browns, right? Because we get a couple of moments in this chapter where Moraine is kind of like generalizing about Verin as a Brown. She's like, oh, she's paying so much attention to the details and the science that she's not actually, getting any um details. She's not actually learning anything about the world. She's not actually applying any of the knowledge, right? And then every once in a while in that conversation, I think even in like italics in her head, Moraine thought there's a few moments where she goes, wait, she was actually paying attention to that, or I can't believe she noticed that. And I will say, I've mentioned before, Perrin, Egwene, and two other characters are my like core four characters. Welcome to number 3. Verin is wonderful. I love this crazy scholar who seems to pay attention more than anyone seems to think she does. This is a wonderful character introduction as far as I'm concerned. I love watching Moraine, who seems to have everything figured out, not be able to figure out Verin for like 4 pages. It's really fun for me.
Is it correct to read her just slightly in the like Sherlock Holmes, Grand Admiral Thrawn, Benoit Blanc mold of somebody who can just spot the patterns a little more easy than necessarily like a deep intelligence, more kind of pattern based and kind of deduction based? Or is it more of a super scholar?
So I think Verin is tricky to read, and so I don't want to give too much of an answer. I will say, of the kind of names you listed, Benoit Blanc is the one that kind of reads most true for Verin, in the sense that I think one of the things that Benoit Blanc has shown in both of the Knives Out movies is that he's very good at like acting the idiot sometimes, and therefore disarming the people he's interrogating. I think that's the move we see Verin pull here. And so it's not entirely clear yet whether she is a Sherlock Holmes put the system together kind of person, or if she just has such intense depth of knowledge from decades of study. She's noted for looking old even for an Aes Sedai. She may just be a step ahead because of how much she knows, but there's definitely, she's in that kind of oddball genius archetype, and I think we're still figuring out exactly where she fits within it. And part of that is because even Moraine hasn't figured her out at this point.
And you said she really likes to wear neckerchiefs, so that's Benoit Blanc too.
Obviously,
so,
yeah.
Interesting, helpful.
I will say, knowing that both of us are scholars and knowing how much I love Verin, I almost wanted to try to get this podcast named after them, and I couldn't think of a name that had the word brown in it that didn't sound terrible. It was impossible.
Welcome back to Brown Ajas. Yeah, that would be a bit strange, especially where my head was before that. I mean, so it's, for me, as we talk about this chapter, it's like I care very little about anything other than the prophecy.
That's fair.
The
Let's
poem.
get to the prophecy.
So, I kind of I did my standard reading of it, and yet kind of was like, I should stop and puzzle all this out. But I thought, well, no, that's why I have Tylor, who will puzzle out what I should. Interesting.
It turns out that's why you have Verin and Moraine.
True. And that was helpful to go through a lot of those. Interesting to me that it is in the form of a poem or a song, essentially, but not presented exactly as such. And that decision is curious to me because, actually reading through it, it felt like something that would be chanted or an incantation of some kind. And the fact that it was written out.
Oh, so I was just going to say, I think Padden Fane was referred to as chanting in a previous chapter. So this may that may fit with the way that we're thinking of, dark prophecy as being chants may fit. Although writing it down, you're right, is odd.
Well, and so for those reasons and the fact that it's a prophecy, my mind went primarily to Macbeth and the witches, right?
Yeah.
That kind of dark prophecy, and all that the witches say is kind of that symbolic language, but also that kind of turning. And any one of these could be the example, but which will he choose? Which will he choose? What hand shelters? What hand slays? But blood feeds blood, blood calls blood, blood is and blood was and blood shall ever be. That type of language where you're like, it says nothing and something at the same time.
Yep.
I think felt Shakespearean and felt, again, like those witches. And I will just put in a plug because I don't think people watched it. There was an Apple TV Macbeth that came out last year. It was directed by one of the Coen brothers. I think it was Joel.
Oh yeah.
And to do Denzel Washington was Macbeth, and Frances McDormand was Lady Macbeth. It was phenomenal, and people should watch it if you at all like Macbeth or are curious about Macbeth. So, so all that being said, like that's where my mind was, particularly because this came from where it came from. It felt like this kind of dark, portentous, really important moment.
I don't have a whole lot else to add because I think that's about as well said as it can be when it comes to kind of the language and, you know, the way that it's presented. So I suggest we go through this paragraph by paragraph really quickly just to kind of make sure if there's any kind of things that we can pull out for readers or anything that would be, you know, easy to miss that we're doing this. So the first section, I'm not going to be doing all of the bloods, but daughter of the night, she walks again. The ancient war she yet fights. Her new lover she seeks. Who shall serve her and die, yet serves still? Who shall stand against her coming? The shining walls shall kneel. And we learn in the discussion later on that the daughter of the night is the name of Lanfear, one of the Forsaken, who we learned earlier were the 13 most powerful users of the one power of the dark. And we also learn that before Lews Therin met his wife, he was in a relationship with Lanfear. So this reference to her new lover, they were suspecting is potentially in some way tied with that previous relationship to the dragon Lews Therin. So I'm curious your thoughts on this presentation of this section of the prophecy. Do you have any kind of Greg's wild predictions about Lanfear or how you think this character might appear or show up?
No, I mean, the overwhelming bit is just the fact that we're getting the revolution of time again, right? That these are coming back. And so to me, it was really setting all of this up as a reminder that we can prophecy this because it's all happened before and it's come before that. So I don't have any wild predictions. I think my mind went to a more symbol-y place until they explained it there. And I was trying to fit like Moraine into the daughter of the night type of a position or something like that. But I'm not going to say that that's what I think it actually is. I think there's a more literal version of it.
Yeah. The second paragraph, then, I think is the most interesting one, in part because it is the most open-ended, and also because I think it is the one that is the least explained by the characters in book. So this one is the man who channels stands alone. He gives his friends for sacrifice. Two roads before him, one to death beyond dying, one to life eternal. Which will he choose? Which will he choose? What hand shelters? What hand slays? Thoughts about this one? Because I think when we read The Man Who Channels, our first impulse is to think Rand, and this is probably the verse that is least analyzed by the characters in book. So I'm curious what you pull out of this.
I think where my mind goes with that is, you know, to Baalzamon continually trying to explain to Rand that he has that choice. He can join him, which I would imagine is death beyond dying, and stand against him, which would be toward life eternal, although Baalzamon would reverse those in some ways, right?
Yeah, well, and this is what I was thinking. I think if this was a light prophecy, I would agree with you. But as this is dark prophecy, I suspect the death or the life eternal would be agreeing to ally with Baalzamon.
You're right. Yeah, I think that's correct. So then death beyond dying is almost a threat. Like you could go that way, but you will not. What hand shelters, what hand slays seems to me to be what his choice, like in expressing the choice, he will have to shelter or slay. But it's just fact here, as presented, that his friends are sacrifice, and whether that's a sacrifice of their relationships or actually them, where we now have Matt under very grave threat and Perrin under seeming great threat. I think it could be much more literal than I would have previously have thought that would be.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, paragraph 3. Luke came to the mountains of doom. Isam waited in the high passes. The hunt is now begun. The Shadow's hounds now course and kill. One did live and one did die, but both are. The time of change has come. Now, I think of this, of the four of our kind of verses, as being the one that is the most recappy, right? We had gotten in the previous book brief mention of the previous generation of the Andorran royal family, including the son Luke, and we had also gotten the story of Malkir, including Isam. This mostly feels like recap for me. The interesting detail, I think, is one did live and one did die, but both are. Any thoughts about what either that or any of the other kind of confusinger imagery in this verse could be portending?
Where I go immediately is we have lots of ways in which dead characters have come back. If that's the shadows or if that's, what have you, heroes rising again. So to me, that is just confirming, yeah, one's alive, one's dead, but they're both going to be a part of this story. Both are kind of still existing.
And I think that that's definitely a reasonable way to read this. And I think this now is going to be going forward, us potentially asking, are there any characters when we meet someone new who we might say, are they related to Isam or Luke? That might be something we'd want to be keeping an eye on kind of throughout this book and further books, knowing the way that Robert Jordan tends to write. Okay, last verse. The Watchers wait on Toman's head. The seed of the hammer burns the ancient tree. Death shall sow and summer burn before the great Lord comes. Death shall reap and bodies fail before the great Lord comes. Again, the seed slays ancient wrong before the great Lord comes. And then there's a lot of blood and death and what have you. So this, again, I think is a pretty straightforward reference to Toman Head, the place that we've been pointed to about 8 times so far this book. But then we get into some of the interesting imagery of the hammer and the ancient tree and all of these things that Moraine and Verin are able to explain, at least vaguely. Did anything jump out at you here? Or was this, for me, this is definitely of the four, the one that I'm like, okay, there's a city at the beginning and not much else. Was there anything here that you keyed in on?
My notes are not good about what I saw in this moment versus what they told me. So this is the portion, though, that they fill in that refers to the Hawk King army. And so I was most interested in the idea that army and the symbols that represent them, that they set out across the sea. And that felt, again, I think we talked about this, like, oh, there's things out there across the sea. And it felt like the elves leading in Lord of the Rings or Arya, I think, did this at the end of Game of Thrones, at least the show. And so it felt to me very interesting that part of it was always that they'd return, right?
Yeah.
But it's now been so long that it has to be generations unless there's something magic going on. This is essentially what they talk us through, right?
Yeah, and we actually learned in the previous chapter that Arthur Hawkwing's armies kind of went over the sea very shortly before his empire collapsed, which I think we can now piece together is roughly 1,000 years ago, maybe 1,100. So generations is possibly even underselling it when we're talking about the scope of how long ago these armies would have left. And I think you're right to say, okay, what is beyond the, map that we are seeing so far, and how is that going to be influencing the story? I actually just got a book called Making the Wheel of Time, or the writing of, I forget exactly what it's called. I'll remember for the next podcast. But at the front of that book is a map that is drawn in the same style as the one that we're familiar with the beginning of this book, but it includes some of the stuff that is off the map, and it is really weird to see the full map. So at some point we will have to discuss that much further down the line when we know what is off the side of the map. But I think that the fact that we keep getting references to that region over and over again, it kind of keys me in on something you were talking about a couple of episodes ago with these kind of early recap and prophecy chapters. One thing that is interesting to think about is which of these are clues for what is coming soon and which of these are clues for things that are kind of we're building towards long term. And so I think the fact that Toman's head has come up 6 times in 6 chapters probably suggests this is a coming soon rather than a long time out. Was there anything else in this section about the prophecy or the character's discussion of prophecy that you wanted to talk about before we get to the boys section of the chapter?
Only that I think some previous time I'd said prophecy annoys me, kind of like dreams, because it often feels like I'm so clever, I'm telling you the things that I know because I'm the person writing this.
Yeah.
And I think because the characters immediately start to work through it, I didn't feel that annoyance here. It was like, okay, it's still a long ways out, but they weren't just supposed to be tantalizing, I'm so clever. It was like, well, this is going to be important that we all figure this out. And here are some immediate clues to fill this in and help us out. So I it all worked for me is all I meant.
Yeah, and I think this is a really nice trick that Robert Jordan has for world building, right? Is if he gives you a vague prophecy and then the world building are clues to understanding the prophecy, it feels more like a word search where you got the definition and can go back and plug it in, as opposed to if he had just given you like 4 paragraphs about the hammer and the tree and Arthur Hawkwing and there was no prophecy to tie it to, it would have been the worst chapter in the book. So I think this is a hats off moment all around. It works effectively as writing and just as world building without it feeling like an exposition dump. Solid work. So we then jump into Perrin's head, which is always welcome for me, and get a really quick section. I think what's interesting to me about this Perrin POV is, as you said, it seems odd in light of the other 2 pieces. I think if this chapter had been a Moraine Rand diptych, I wouldn't have had quite as much of an issue, right? If we had paired those 2 stories together. It's adding the Perrin story in the middle that makes it feel much more disjointed and, not quite clear what the link is between all of the stories. I'm curious whether there was anything that jumped out at you here then. I know you said you were investigating what tied the stories together. Was there anything in trying to do that made you think, here's why this Perrin segment is in here?
The biggest thing in that category for me was just that he establishes that he was in the garden when the others were in the dungeon. Yeah. And it seemed that was Robert Jordan putting him in the innocent column for us, that whoever is conspiring and helping, maybe you suspected Perrin after the dream, maybe you're just nervous about Perrin. It wasn't like I blacked out and came to in the garden. It was I was out in the garden taking a break, or however he says it. And so I thought that, if the goal here then is to kind of deal with the aftermath of this innocent, we want to make very clear that Perrin is not responsible and has, not just an alibi for not being guilty, but a reason why he's not also kind of cursed or knocked out like the other 2 were in the dungeon.
Yeah, and I think that works really effectively in this scene because we highlight the fact that Perrin is both not kind of directly involved in the kind of violent conflict in this chapter, and then are immediately reminded that, as he said in the previous book, he has his protection now, but that protection comes with its own set of challenges, right? I think this is, in this section, we learn that Leandrin is looking for him. We learn that Lyanna is curious about his eyes. We learn that Moraine has been talking about him at least a little bit to these characters. And so all of this, I think, is ramping up some kind of social tension for Perrin, where a lot of the other characters are dealing with much more kind of direct threats. And I think that's interesting to see. As you're saying, this is both effective kind of alibi creation, but also it's making sure that we're not kind of getting pigeonholed into only one sort of conflict in this book. That works fairly well for me. Other than that, we get again, weird, I think 3 times in this chapter, someone flirts with Perrin and then references being one of the Green Aja. But other than that, there's not much here. So I suggest we jump finally to the Rand sequence at the end of the chapter. To me, the most interesting piece here is all of the kind of customs that Lan is teaching Rand and how he's clearly almost getting some like enjoyment out of choosing. I don't know whether they're odd customs or unexpected ones or, things that Rand wouldn't be expected to know. But you can tell that Lan is almost like playing a game in what he is teaching Rand in some way. And that I think worked really well for me. Did you get that same kind of feel or impression when you were reading the scene? Or did you get a different kind of impulse when we were going through all of those different kind of traditions that Rand would have to uphold or bring to the Umberland seat?
I think the sense of fun, like you said, is what kind of came through most of all. I was just trying to remember there was some recent movie where this was a thing, and it was like, do all these specific movements or else the king will behead you or something, and then just like getting dumped in a room. And I can't think of what it was, but that is also just a scene we've seen a lot, right?
Yeah.
Like quick, this is the highly regulated court, and you have to follow these customs, and they're silly and they're stupid, but don't do them wrong. See ya.
Yeah.
And maybe the piece that I don't think you said in your summary, I apologies if I just am forgetting, but it was really interesting to me that the last chapter ended and it was like Lan was telling Rand, like, you can still go, like, you should go, like, get out of here. And I think this chapter begins with him having, he says, like, over the course of the night, he thought about going like 5 times, he even got up out of bed and stayed. And so when Lan returns, it's like, well, nope, now you're here. Like, and so in this kind of fatherly, mentorly role, it's like very much what you said. It's like, well, I'm going to help you survive the choices you have now made. And that kind of attitude comes through a lot in the teaching of those customs.
Well, and I kind of love the behind the scenes dynamic that we are able to piece together here, right? Because I think what you're doing is a perfect job of kind of analyzing what is Rand's motivation in terms of like, why wasn't he leaving before and how is he stuck now? And how does that, fit in with like Lan's timeline? But I think there's also something really interesting to the 2 Lan moments that you're identifying where 24 hours ago, Lan says, Moraine says you're okay to leave. And then immediately afterwards, more or less before Rand has had enough time to leave, Siuan says you have to stay, right? And since we know those 2 characters are in cahoots, there's no way that that doesn't happen without them having a conversation where Moraine says, I need to make it seem like he can leave. You need to be the reason he has to stay. And so this is one of those things that I think is really interesting to piece together, especially with Aes Sedai politics. Who knows what when can sometimes be fun to look at. And once we learn about secret alliances like Moraine and Siuan, we see those alliances then play out, in other places in interesting ways.
Yeah, I hadn't quite pieced that together, but I agree that the competing messages, we also had the tantalizing bit at the end of the last chapter, which was that it was definitely not Anglamar who had ordered the castle closed. So it is a lot of games being played with that stuff. And, you just pointed that these 2 moments would probably have been orchestrated in concert. I don't know about that third one being a part of that as well, but it does feel like, the cross messaging is, we're seeing the effects of it, even if we're not understanding the basis of it.
Well, and I think that that's really interesting. We're getting kind of intentional cross messaging with Siuan and Moraine, and then we're getting unintentional cross messaging with Lan and Moraine, right? Because Lan makes it clear in this chapter that he is not doing all of this because Moraine told him to. If anything, he's almost like on the DL, like, don't tell Moraine about this, right? Like, I may be doing something that's in your best interest and not hers. And so seeing that simultaneous characters working together and accidentally working against each other in interesting, unexpected ways, I think works really effectively here. I've only got one thing at the very end of the chapter left to discuss. Was there anything else in this conversation between Rand and Lan that jumped out at you?
No, I have nothing else in my notes.
I think the only last thing that I wanted to mention here is that Lan gives the pin of the Red Eagle of Manetheren to Rand, which I think is really interesting in light of the conversation that they had way back in chapter 1, right? Because I think we briefly highlighted the line that Lan has that in the Borderlands, if someone raises a child, that child is theirs, right? Adoption 100% kind of implies fatherhood. And so I think it's really interesting that Lan, one of only maybe 3 characters who knows that Rand isn't from the 2 rivers, chooses to give him something that specifically connects him to his kind of chosen family as opposed to his blood family. And I just think that's a really nice kind of moment in light of the Borderlanders philosophy we had seen in the previous chapter, and I think worth highlighting. So I'll let you mention anything you have about that and then kind of take us out of the episode.
Yeah, it also, the way you just described that, it also feels like it could be a rebuke on Moraine. to remind her this isn't just who he is. He may be the chosen one or the dragon or all these things, but like remember he's also a boy from Two Rivers and of those ancient people. And we do know that the other boys had the battle cries of the Menethrin, I don't somewhere around
probably
there.
One of those.
And we know he is not of that bloodline and didn't have that, but has something going on. So we're there. So yeah, again, I think just to close out our discussion these two chapters, I'm starting to get a little antsy. I'm about to announce the names of the next two chapters. So I think those imply that we're finally going to get underway. But I think that's about right? We're like 100 and change into this book, and I think it's time to really get going and see where this adventure leads us. So we did want to pause at the end here and just note that next week is going to be another 2 chapters week. It's chapter 8, The Dragon Reborn, and chapter 9, Leave Takings. Longtime listeners will note that we have hesitated when the length of the chapters get very long to make sure we're not assigning too much reading like the good professors we are. But what we observed is that there's not a shorter chapter on either side of these. And so instead of doing two too low page counts, we're just going to ask for this one stretch for this book. Pretty much for the rest of the run of The Great Hunt, it will be our standard kind of 30 to 40 pages, but this one stretches just a little longer. It might be the most reading we've assigned. So
I think it is by like 100 words.
Okay. Yeah. So not ridiculous, but we hope you don't mind. We at some point promised to kind of make this a group decision, and yet we still just hand down these dictates because of our recording schedule and so on. But we hope you'll bear with us. We hope you can, handle just a little bit extra reading. Especially in these cold winter months, if you're listening to us as these come out, what better thing to do than gather together, read some pages under a couch or on a couch under a blanket with a cup of
or
coffee,
under a
tea,
couch.
or libation, or under a couch. And whether you get out from under that couch or not, we will see you next time through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.